Uh, so in that case, you could actually, if you want them to be posting their reports, they're right there, the same thing where our people be posting it. We work out the grading and whatever, however, I grade ours, you grade yours, or whatever makes you happy.
Right.
For you online people, CV people, everybody, we've got the lab schedule. I posted it in an announcement in Canvas. It officially, we're not going to have one this week because it's not working out with both of the places that we're wanting to go to. So it's going to be next Friday. It's going to be the first one. We'll be going to the Old Dominion Organic Farm and we'll be looking at their crops. They got some pigs and that kind of stuff. Then we'll be going to the parish, to Chuck Parish's tobacco, corn, soybeans, and whatever else he decides to grow on any given year. So we'll be checking out his operation. That's going to be next Friday. 2 weeks after that, we'll be going to the state fair. I can't remember the entire schedule from here, but we are going to go to Beef Cattle Farm. And Taylor, to answer your question last week, I think there's a pretty good chance we're going to be getting an extension agent to show up with us, and we can maybe manage to turn that into a beef quality assurance training thing. That's the goal, that's the dream. If not, we'll just learn to do some basic cattle handling kind of thing, but hopefully we can officially turn that into a BQA thing. A little bit later in the semester, I can't remember the dates, we'll go to the Parish Pumpkin Patch, talk about agritourism. We'll go to the bull sale at Red House, that's the first weekend in December, and Richland's Dairy. So we'll be going to dairy operation, and they have a creamery there, so we can get milkshakes or ice cream at the end of it. And that might be it. It seems like there's another one, but I can't remember. But anyway, there's 7 total. So what I'm in the process of doing it, but Canvas and Google aren't playing very well this morning, but I'm going to post a thing in Canvas sometime earlier today to where you'll sign up and let me know, are you going to meet the people and driving from Alberta? Are you going to meet me driving a vehicle from Keysville? Are you going to meet us actually at Old Dominion Farms, or are you going to do an online alternative because you cannot meet us? But I'll need everybody to go in there and log in and check the box. Type in your name so I know who you are, and check the box for where you're going. So I have a count of who's going where, so I know, do I need big van, little van, bicycle, what kind of transportation is going to be needed. It'll really only take you, it's literally, you type your name, you check the box, and that's pretty much it. We should be done around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. It just depends. I'm not sure how long we're going to be at Old Dominion Farms. So the time something is just going to be my best guess, but we'll be meeting in Keysville like 9 o'clock in the morning. Y'all be meeting here, well, we'll be aiming to get to the Old Dominion Farms at 10, so schedule your time accordingly. And so the next weekend it's in Dundas, so next Friday.
I have a question.
Yes.
I will not be able to make the trip next Friday because I will be at a state 4-H horse show. How will I make that trip up or lab up?
There will be instructions that I haven't quite turned up yet about it. An alternative you can do would be the same thing the online people are going to do, where you would see if you can go and visit an organic farm operation or go visit a tobacco operation and write up what you've seen, kind of thing. The details on how to make it up will be on. They'll be showing up in Canvas within 48 hours. How about that?
All right, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on the left? Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
Well, very good. Thank you, Tom. And I'll just add there that for those at Southwest and for our students seated here, we're also going to do labs kind of on a similar schedule and similar types. Don't have that, posted yet, but working through it. And for those of you at Southwest, we're going to try to actually do some of those, over in your neck of the woods, and kind of meet at a central location. So like I'll get the bus here at Highlands, and then we'll drive over to probably a park and ride facility, meet there. Yet to determine the details, but again, pay attention to Canvas, and I'm going to try to get one set up for us on that same date. So our labs will kind of be due on the same timeline. And again, we'll have some sort of alternative for you if you can't make it. But these trips are important, so I'd encourage you guys online to try to make them if possible. I'm also going to try to use our GoPro camera to record some of the labs that way. And I don't know how that's really going to work, but we'll give it a try anyway. And we'll just see if you guys can, maybe we can work that out as a potential part of an alternative anyway. So just throw that out there. On the quiz and module stuff, I know we're having some difficulties with Canvas, and I think I've got most of that worked out. I'm still meeting with our distance education person to finish that today. I removed the prerequisite, but I forgot to hit the publish button for the next chapter. So I'm sorry I didn't get you guys the slide sheet for this week. I'm going to try to get those ahead of time from now on. That way you guys can get in there. The prerequisite will usually be, based on the quiz, but you still want to click through everything in order for it to open it up for you so you can get to the next module. On the quiz, don't worry too much about the grade that shows up when you finish the quiz, because I usually have to go back through there and grade some stuff anyway. Also, there's always some finicky issue with the quizzes. So wait until after we review them in class to check your actual grade. So I actually curve a lot of those based on questions that everybody missed. I'm not going to go over that today though, just because there are some people that did not do the quiz. And since this is the first quiz, I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of extra time. Don't get used to that though. From here on out, the deadlines will be hard deadlines. So do the quiz, do it on time, get it in. But I don't want you guys to have a 0 for your first quiz. So just open that up for a few more days. And that's going to be due Saturday night, so I can grade it on Sunday. So on Monday, we can discuss it. Anyway, hope you guys had a happy Labor Day. We're going to move on and start talking about Chapter 2 here, looking at ecology. And there's a lot to cover here, but I'm going to try to cover it all in this one period. So forgive me if I go a little fast, but I think I've tried to boil it down to just the key concepts here. So let me get this up on the screen.
Oh, you may hear some banging. They're doing some work on the roof, among other things, here in this building. If it gets annoying, let me know and I'll mute our mic.
All right, well, we'll have to complain since they complained about us, right? No, just kidding.
Yes.
All right, let's get into ecosystems. And really, I kind of think of the ecology aspect as it's very important, because not only are we thinking about just the ecology around us, the environment around us, but also any kind of agriculture as part of an ecosystem. For my undergraduate, I actually studied agroecology, which is looking at agriculture as ecology. So anyway, let's get into it. It all starts with energy from the sun, right? So almost all terrestrial ecosystems depend on the ability of plants, what we call autotrophs, to capture that energy from the sun. And then they store it in these complex organic molecules that we'll talk about a little later on when we get into the plant chemistry. It's the actual climate, though, that determines the kind of plants that can grow naturally in the area and the rate at which they grow. Mostly looking there at temperature and moisture as the driving factors of the productivity of plants. Finally here, the natural ecosystems tend to be more complex than our crop ecosystems. it's kind of a given, right? There's more things interacting there. There are more plants, right? Depending on what kind of agriculture you're conducting. If you're doing some sort of forage, then it can be pretty complex, right? Because you're growing not just one species, like in a field of corn, you're growing many different species in your forage fields. So it can tend to be somewhat complex, but generally speaking, natural ecosystems are more complex. The more a crop ecosystem, they say here, differs from the natural ecosystem, the more difficult it is to sustain. More on that later on. So thinking of an ecosystem as basically just the groups of organisms interacting with their environment in both the living and non-living aspects. So we look at communities of these organisms and populations of individual species that come together and interact with the climate and the weather to make an ecosystem. It's all part of the greater ecology. And many of the most important organisms and ecological processes in these ecosystems are actually not visible to us. Doesn't mean that they're not there. No, they're happening, right? But we just can't see them. That's mostly due to things like microscopic organisms. These microorganisms, especially things like in the soil. We can't forget that there's a food web taking place above ground, but there's also one taking place below ground in the soil. Also, it's important to note that ecology and the principles of ecology does not disappear when we grow plants in our homes or in a greenhouse. Still, the same factors of ecology are taking place. And ecology, the word, I always like to break the words down. It comes from the Greek oikos and logia. So oikos is home, your home. And logia, of course, is the study of. So literally, ecology is the study of the home. And in doing so, we're studying that environment around us, and it's the same. The ecological principles still occur whether we're indoors, outdoors, in a greenhouse, out in the field, wherever. We still have those same processes and principles taking place. And we're a part of it. We're actually what we would think of as a keystone species because we tend to have a great influence on the ecology and ecosystems around us. In agroecosystems, the agricultural ecosystems, some of the organisms, processes, and interactions that would be in a natural system are either not there or they're heavily modified. So it could still be the same principles, but we've changed it. So instead of natural nutrient cycling that occurs in the carbon or nitrogen cycle, we might add nutrients in the form of synthetic fertilizers. Or we might use these external inputs like chemical pesticides needed to suppress diseases or fungal outbreaks or just insect outbreaks. So we changed the dynamic. Another reason why we in the agroecosystems as well as in natural ecosystems tend to be a keystone species. So what we want to try to do is examine this full range of interactions and processes that occur in the natural ecosystems and kind of compare them and contrast them to learn how we can manage our agroecosystems, our crop ecosystems, to achieve sustainability. There's an ecologist out there, Wes Jackson, you may have heard of him. He started the Land Institute in Kansas, which is trying to breed perennial grain crops because they, in their mind anyway, are more sustainable. And Wes Jackson is quoted as saying that he believes that we cannot do better than nature. He's saying that our crop ecosystems, we can't get them to the point to where they are producing more than a natural ecosystem. However, he does also say that we should try to emulate the natural ecosystems and take those principles to put them into our agriculture to make it more sustainable. Makes sense to me. So we think of the resources, right? So plants, as our primary producers, they need light, water, and nutrients to grow. They may also require other agents such as pollinators and modes for dispersal of their seeds in order to reproduce. So these are, in a way, natural resources that the plants are using. And competition is this very important ecological principle that occurs when more than one organism is drawing on the same limiting resource. And what we really are looking at here is that a single species can't utilize all of those resources in any given environment, although humans come pretty close sometimes, right? But if they are competing over the same resource, then one of them is going to win generally. So to coexist, species have to compete for different limiting resources. It's important to note the whole limiting resource too. They can use different resources, right? But if it's the same resource and it's a limiting resource, then it creates this competition. And it kind of goes into the organism's niche, which the niche is just the role and the position that a species has in its environment. You kind of think of it as like its job, it's as well as its kind of address, where it lives and what it does in the ecosystem. And part of that is the resources that it consumes. And we can think of this, there's a classic example of warblers. Different species of this bird, the warbler, will actually feed on potentially the same insect, the same limiting resource, but they'll do it at different parts of a tree. So like, for example, the chestnut-sided warbler is eating those insects at the top of the tree, whereas the yellow-bellied warbler is eating them towards the bottom of the tree. So they're competing for the same resource, but in a different niche. So that way they're not really in direct competition with each other. If that makes sense. In a healthy natural ecosystem, every available niche tends to be filled and the resources fully exploited. However, when we make changes to those ecosystems, then we change that, of course, which we make all kinds of unintentional changes to those ecosystems through direct or indirect impacts. When we have these intact, healthy natural ecosystems, it's difficult for new species to enter the environments because there are not unexploited resources and open niches. And this is where we get into this whole law of competitive exclusion. So no two organisms occupying the same niche and basically competing for the same limiting resource can exist. They can only exist if they're occupying different niches or competing for different resources. One will always win. And we can apply this to our agriculture and our agricultural ecosystems in many different ways as well. So one of the things that we think of, and probably the easiest example, is niches being available for weeds in our agro-ecosystem. So say we're growing a field of corn, for instance. Whenever we plow the soil, we're making this ideal environment for not just the corn, this optimal condition for it to grow, but also for many weeds to grow. And if there is bare soil, a weed will grow in it. So a bare soil is a niche, and they're going to compete for the same resources that the corn is competing for, right? And eventually one of them is going to win. So they're going to be competing for light, they're going to be competing for water, space, nutrients. So one weed control strategy here that is kind of emulating this natural ecosystem, ecological paradigm, is to plant additional non-competitive crop plants or non-crop plants to occupy those niches that would otherwise be occupied by weeds, like cover crops. So for example, we might undersow our corn with clover. That way there is no niche for the weeds to come in and occupy. So we're going to look at some of these ecological relationships as well, and how these resources can be lost, not necessarily directly through competition, but other means. So these other relationships like predation or parasitism, where the crops could be consumed by an herbivore, the pests, right? Whether that's a mollusk, a slug, or a snail, an arthropod, an insect, or a mite, or mammals like deer, right? Or birds even. All these can be pests that are either predators to our crop or parasites of them. Our crop ecosystems usually tend to be more vulnerable, though, than natural ecosystems because the number of predators tend to be lower, or in some cases, non-existent. That's why we have to use these other means, such as chemicals, or the introduction of predators or parasites to control them, or the introduction of ourselves, like hunters, right? So we go in there and we hunt the deer to prevent them from eating our corn. So we have parasitism, which usually tends to be a long-term relationship between the host and the pathogen, which is the parasite itself, what affects it. And generally, the host doesn't usually die, or at least not until the very end when that parasite has reproduced, because that would also kill the pathogen itself. This is an example of not really a parasitic relationship. This is more of a mutualistic relationship, or a commensalistic relationship, depending on how you look at it. But mycorrhiza is a fungal relationship where this fungus grows on the roots of plants and allows the minerals and nutrients to be taken up easier by the plants. So in some cases, we're actually now, mimicking that thing in nature by adding mycorrhiza to soil mixes, or actually adding it to the crops to try to reduce our need for synthetic fertilizers. So this is just a form of symbiosis, and parasitism is also a form of symbiosis, a symbiotic relationship, a relationship in which two organisms together, either one benefits and does not benefit in the case of parasitism, or in the case of mutualism, where they both benefit. And like the rhizobium or mycorrhiza, that's kind of the case where both of them benefit. For the bacteria or fungi that live on the roots, they have a habitat, a place to live. And then the plant benefits by getting those nutrients. So that's mutualism, a mutually beneficial association. Then we have commensalism, where one of the organisms benefits, but the other is not harmed, nor does it benefit. And so on the quiz for this, we have a question that is basically looking at different examples of these relationships. Just know the basics here, where parasitism, one organism is harmed, the other one benefits. Mutualism, they both benefit. Commensalism, one is not harmed or benefited, the other one is benefited. Earlier I mentioned that the plants are autotrophic, meaning that they are able to produce their own food as long as they have energy from the sun and nutrients from the soil and water. So plants are primary producers. They're the basis of, or not all, but most ecosystems. And even in, say aquatic ecosystems, even in the ocean, there are plant species or an algae that does the kind of same thing. It becomes that, very beginning step, taking energy from the sun to make these sugars that then move up. And we think of these trophic levels. So you can see in this image, we have the trophic levels being coded here, color-coded. So the green are the primary producers, the first trophic level. The orange or reddish tint here is that second level. So that energy is moving up from, say, the sugars to the next level, whatever eats the plants, and then up to the next level, but by whatever eats that organism. And it's a complex web of relationships. We used to think of the food chain, but we know it doesn't just go one way. It goes multiple directions. So we think of it more as the food web rather than the food chain. Here we're also going to talk about the biomes. So this all started with an explorer, Alexander von Humboldt, looking at the progression of different vegetation types as he explored. So as he moved north or south from the equator, or changed in latitude or altitude, so he changed in latitude going away from the equator, changed from altitude going up into mountains, and he noted that the same kinds of vegetation tended to occur in similar climatic conditions around the world. So those recurrent vegetation types are known as biomes. They're kind of like the mother of the ecosystem, the very general aspect of the ecosystem. A collection of ecosystems with similar climate, soil, and plant composition. So looking at this image of the globe, we're looking at some of the things that cause these changes in biomes. So first, we just have the movement away from the equator. The equator is tropical. The temperature does not change there. So as we move away from the equator in both directions, we start to get cooler generally. And because of that, we have different vegetation types. We also have these westerlies and trade winds that is basically moving air on a global level. It's also related to the ocean currents here. But this air circulation moves bodies of moisture. So this creates a desert biome, which is the largest biome on the planet, where these bodies of moisture are moved away from these larger areas of land. So you can see the different desert biomes where the moisture is moved away, often in both directions. So you see here in the arid southwest of the U.S., it's being moved away towards the equator as well as away from the equator. That moisture is being moved away to make a very arid, dry area, making it all desert-like. We have sections of South America that are the same, Australia and Africa. We have these movements of moisture, creating the desert biome. Between 40 and 50 degrees, we have at least areas where we have significant rainfall. We have temperate deciduous forests, a different biome, which is what we have in our region, right? Between deserts and forests, we have grasslands and savannas, and these are basically, again, just a flux in moisture. So it's not enough moisture to be a forest. So instead, we have grasslands and savannas. So different biome there, different types of plants, different types of soils, different ecosystems altogether. And then in some areas, especially above 60 degrees north, somewhat above at the 60 degrees south as well, we have this boreal forest, or taiga, which is actually the second largest biome on planet Earth. Sorry. And the reason why we have this taiga is because in these latitudes, it's much colder. making a very short season of plant growth and low diversity of plant types that grow there. Dominated by coniferous trees. So North America, especially Canada, parts of Alaska, are this taiga. This type of vegetation is almost absent when we look at the southern hemisphere, just because there's very little land there around that 60-degree latitude mark. There's a little bit, but not much. So what do they do in taiga? Does it mean that agriculture doesn't exist? No, it doesn't. There still is some agriculture taking place, even in parts of Russia, which is dominantly this taiga, or also potentially some tundra too. There's still some small-scale food production going on, and it's interesting there because in the summer there's a lot more light, right? If you think about like going to Alaska in the summer, the further north you go, the more light there is in the summer because of the tilt of the Earth on its axis. In the summer months, it's pointed directly towards the sun, so they have 20+ hours of sunlight. Therefore, they do still have a growing season. They have agriculture taking place. It's short, but it's very intense. So check out some pictures of like cabbage grown in Alaska, for instance. They're massive heads of cabbage because of that intense growing season. We also have the tundra north of the taiga, where the ground is permanently frozen. There's some issues, though, where we do have a summer melt period at the lower latitudes of this, where we will have some vegetation, usually very small shrubs, sedges, and grasses. But there's not really the ability to do any crop production. However, we do note that especially the tundra is being affected by human influence. In the tundra, mostly due to climate change. As we have rising temperatures, a lot of that snow and ice is beginning to melt. As that accelerates, below that, there actually was once land. They say below Antarctica, I mean, that there is potentially vegetation under there from continental drift. Either way, what happens when that ice melts? When that permafrost recedes, then the vegetation that was below there will then begin to decompose and rapidly release carbon dioxide and methane. So almost all biomes have been influenced by human activity. Again, we are a keystone species. Grasslands have been plowed for agriculture. The Midwest was once all just tons of prairie. And they say that that was actually one of the largest emissions, single emissions in history of carbon into the atmosphere, was through the plowing of the prairie. Temperate forests, almost all of our temperate forests in eastern North America has been logged at some point. Very little old growth or virgin forest left. A lot of it has returned, especially in Virginia, to woodland since there hasn't been as much logging, although it does still take place. Much of tropical rainforests, and the thing with the tropical forest biomes are, one, that they're closer to the equator, so they're warmer, but they also receive tons and tons of precipitation, so that the bodies of moisture that are moving away from the desert areas are often moving towards the equator, creating tropical rainforests. And of course, we have a lot of tropical rainforests being cleared. We talked about that a little bit last week, looking at the current crisis of the Amazon burning. Again, that's not just due to natural like lightning strike and forest fires. It's actually intentional clearing of that land for agricultural purposes. Wetlands are not really a biome because they don't necessarily exist over a wide area. Generally, they do exist where bodies of moisture meet. So creeks, streams, rivers meeting with lakes or seas or oceans tend to be where we have these wetlands. And these are very important ecological buffer zones. Very high biodiversity there. However, we tend to drain wetlands for agricultural purpose, which, you know, for many reasons, I mean, it makes really good farmland to drain wetlands. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Yeah, well, I mean, depends on how you look at it, right? Could be good for a person practicing the agriculture, might not be good for the organisms that live there. We actually have a place nearby us called Shady Valley. It's over on the Tennessee border. Over on the Tennessee side. You go over the mountain, it's a high elevation valley that was once one of the largest cranberry bogs inland. And it was drained by the Army Corps of Engineers for agricultural land. Now there's very little of that natural ecosystem left, although there are a few spots of it that are intact. So yeah, wetlands characterized by the fact that they're extremely wet, right? And they tend to accumulate lots and lots of organic matter. So when we drain that moisture off of there, that organic matter is available for crops. But they're very important, especially if we think about barrier islands and wetlands as these buffer zones to protect us from things like hurricanes. Areas where these wetlands are tend to, you know, be a place that helps to kind of prevent massive flooding as much, things like Hurricane Dorian. They do tend to become very productive areas when they're drained. They're also very productive as a natural ecosystem due to that available water. When we drain them, they become susceptible in the natural ecosystem to drought. So here's an important thing to note right here in terms of agriculture and ecology is that almost all the land that can be easily cultivated, what we would refer to as arable land, is already being used for the production of crops. So can we really increase the land area available for crops? Maybe to a certain extent, and if we practice different types of agriculture, but we're not making any more land, are we? So with the world population pressure, something that a lot of y'all put on the quiz as one of the big issues for agriculture in the 21st century, we do need to produce more food with more people. So how do we do that? Wes Jackson at the Land Institute would argue that we need to try to simulate more of the natural ecosystems to more sustainably produce more food on less land. That's just one potential answer. Be interested to see what your ideas are. We talk about ecology and ecosystems. We look at the plant's actual productivity, and we look at primary productivity or net primary productivity as the amount of biomass produced by the plants, which tend to be measured by the amount of carbon dioxide taken from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and then formed into biomass in terms of the bodies of the plants. So that's this carbon, part of the carbon cycle and the fixation of carbon, because plants need CO2 in order to make the sugars, along with sunlight and moisture. So when we're looking at these terrestrial ecosystems, we look at them in terms of their productivity. And as we see here, tropical forest and tropical savanna are the two most productive, but they only make up less than a quarter of the land area on Earth. So they're very productive, but that's because we have high temperature and high moisture. Temperate forest is almost as productive, but because it's only photosynthetically active, for part of the year, and it only occupies about 7% of the land surface of Earth, it does not contribute nearly as much to the global primary productivity. The other three big ones here, big contributors, boreal forest, the taiga, temperate grasslands, and croplands, are only about it's half as productive as temperate and tropical forests and savannas. So here we're just looking at the contributions of that global productivity from these biomes, which tend to match their share of land area on Earth. 1/3 of the Earth's surface is occupied by tundra, which is mostly permanent ice, desert, semi-desert, which only contributes about 4% of the productivity, even though it's 1/3 of the land of Earth. Urban areas, by comparison, are about as productive as tundra, but they only occupy about 1.5% of the Earth's surface. So crop productivity is not usually considered the same as net primary productivity of an ecosystem, because for crop productivity, we're actually looking at a very specific part of the plant, what is being harvested, rather than the whole plant, the biomass that is being produced in a natural ecosystem. So what we're trying to do in some respects, we were talking about the whole biofuel thing a little bit last week with Jeffrey's question there. We try to figure out other ways of using what would be waste products. So with the biofuel, they're pairing that often with some sort of feedlot production as well. So they're using all parts of that plant. So it's a higher form of productivity than just regular crop productivity. Maybe we're recycling or composting some of the waste of the crop. That's another way of getting that carbon that was fixed in the plant back into the soil rather than having it emitted into the atmosphere. Another big thing in ecology, whether it's an agroecosystem or a natural ecosystem, is the change in plant communities over time. Ecological succession. And this is a dynamic process. It's not static. It's always changing until we reach this climax community. And the climax community is somewhat theoretical, because does it really exist as a climax community permanently? No, there's still changes in every ecosystem. So one of what we think of as a climax community here in Eastern North America and the Mid-Atlantic would be like an old growth forest. However, trees die and fall. That creates an opening in that climax community, and then ecological succession tends to reoccur. So think of succession as, first, let's just say that we clear forest land for timber, and then we start doing agriculture on it. But at some point, the agriculture is abandoned. What happens? Trees start growing back. The pioneer species move in first. So we have a little flux there where we have this kind of old field community, which we see a lot in our region, where it's been abandoned from an agricultural process, so it's being filled up with things like junipers. Eastern red cedars are growing back first. Those are the pioneer plants, and then provide shelter for trees like pines or hardwoods, that then grow up and then become forests. And then eventually that becomes the climax community. So with succession, one of the issues that we have is how we've affected that natural succession. We tend to leave a plot of land that we've disturbed open now, then a lot of times it's colonized by pioneer species that are aliens, invasive species. These really bad invasive weeds that come in and are easily able to outcompete our native plants for resources. They tend to be bad for the greater ecology as a whole, because they provide refuge often for diseases and other non-native organisms. For instance, here on our campus, we have a big area that was set aside for wildlife habitat. However, we had graded that area and removed the topsoil. So what came in were these pear trees, these invasive like Bradford pears. What grows on them are these little tiny pears that are not really palatable for our native mammals or birds, but the starlings love them. So we have these massive flocks of starlings that come in when these pears are ripening. They come in, they flock, they crap all over the place, and when they do that, they're also potentially causing health concerns for people too. There's this disease known as histoplasmosis that basically we can inhale the spores from this disease from the drying feces of these birds. So anyway, it's a gloomy kind of thing that happens when we let go of land without having some intentional changes to it. Anyway, that's due mostly to the globalization of trade. So we have a long history of moving plants and organisms around intentionally or by accident. And in that case, we've introduced a lot of these species and diseases associated with some of them. For instance, one of the classic examples in Eastern North America is the chestnut blight. So we brought in Asian varieties of chestnuts and species. When we did that, we accidentally also introduced chestnut blight. Chestnuts the American chestnut once made up 2/3 of the canopy of our eastern forests. When the chestnut blight came in, it killed all of these trees off. The timber industry came in, and because the chestnuts were really important for the timber crop, and they harvested what was left. And in doing so, probably removed a lot of the resistant species. Anyway, what we have is almost the entire loss of the species, the American chestnut, which has all kinds of other ecological ramifications, because a lot of animals use the chestnut as an important food source. So what happened when the chestnut is gone? That food source is gone. So if we have any hunters out there, if you talk to, well, I don't know if many are still alive today, but those that hunted before the loss of the American chestnut would say that the meat had a different flavor. Now the wild game eats mostly acorns and hickory nuts. Acorns have bitter tannins in them, which changes the flavor of that wild game meat. So there's a lot of different effects that can come with what we've done to natural ecosystems, these unintended effects. Another example would be the hemlock woolly adelgid. We accidentally introduced it. They say actually the site of introduction was in Richmond, Virginia. And since then, it's spread throughout the eastern United States, through Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and devastated our natural hemlock populations. And the side effect that has, again, for fishermen, is that eventually can affect trout populations, because the hemlocks are growing near water, they're shading the streams, keeping lower temperatures, allowing for the trout to survive. So unintended effects of accidentally introducing these organisms. Anyway, let's move on. We could talk about that all day. But I wanted to point out a few things that we're starting to try to do that could have some impact on some of the natural ecosystems, as well as maybe making money too. So in 2008, the World Bank committed to start to offer tropical countries carbon offset credits for preserving their forests instead of logging them. And this carbon offset system was created in this climate exchange, and you can still do it. It's not a big thing right now, but I think one day, if we ever start to take the whole climate change thing seriously, this could become a potential area of, if you can prove that you are sequestering carbon in your soil on your farm, then you could, get carbon offset credits, which you could sell to someone who is emitting carbon. So it's just another way to potentially make money off of agriculture. So I want to throw that out there. I think we're going to see that happening more, possibly, potentially, especially in countries that have signed on to the climate accords. Anyway, thinking about energy. Most of the energy that we consume for our food supply is actually not as much involved in the production of the crops themselves, but more for the transportation, processing, and storage of the crops. This is mostly occurring, though, in developed countries, industrialized nations. So, as we noted, last week we were talking about one of the issues of, the world population changing is that they change their diets when they start to develop. It increases the impact of climate. If they start to do this type of lifestyle where we are producing, optimal crops optimally in, say, California, and then transporting them all around the country, all around the world, then that, movement of crops, the processing and storage of them would account for about half of the world's energy supply. So on that note, there's something that we got to change there. And plant science and technology is the field that is contributing to those changes the most. And that's the end of our chapter 2. Does anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns immediately? Sorry, I know that's a lot to cover in a little bit of time. I'll open up the quiz today, and I'll give you guys a week to finish that quiz. So that'll be due next Wednesday, 11:59 p.m. All right, well, if we don't have any other questions or concerns, we'll go ahead and sign off.
The only thing I'm going to add is I did get the lab trip sign-up stuff posted in Canvas. So it's there ready for you. So please sign up.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. And I'll try to do the same thing where we have a sign up for those that might join us from Southwest.
Okay. Did Hunter ever show up? Well, I guess I'll dial back and then. Oh, you there?
Yeah, Hunter's here, and we'll shift the camera over for the next class.
Okay, cool. Well, see y'all in a few minutes.
Thank you.